The Supreme Court just made a major decision today that could affect gun rights across America. They've agreed to hear a new case called United States versus Monty, and this case raises a pretty serious question. Can the federal government take away your right to own a gun permanently? Not because you did anything violent, but just because you did something they don't approve of? This is a big deal, and it's going to make the Supreme Court answer some tough questions about who actually gets Second Amendment protection in this country. Before we get into the details, I need you to do something really quick. Smash that like button right now if you care about protecting your Second Amendment rights. It only takes a second, and it makes a huge difference in getting this information out to more people who need it. Also, if you're not already subscribed to the channel, hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any future updates on your rights. Trust me, you're going to want to stay informed about this stuff. Let me break down what this case is really about. At the heart of it is a federal law, specifically 18 U.S.C. Section 922G3. This law says that if you're using illegal drugs or if you're addicted to them, you can own a gun. Now, you might have seen this law before if you've ever bought a firearm. It's one of those questions on the form 4473 that you fill out when you buy a gun from a dealer. They ask you if you're an unlawful user of controlled substances or if you're addicted to them. That question comes directly from this federal law. But here's where it gets interesting. This case isn't really just about drugs or drug use. What it's really about is much bigger. It's about who the government considers part of the people that the Second Amendment talks about. Who gets to have gun rights? And when can a government decide you're not a law-abiding citizen anymore and take those rights away? These are fundamental questions that go to the core of what the Second Amendment means. The case centers around this question. Does the Constitution only protect what the government calls law-abiding, responsible citizens, and does the government get to decide who fits that description? Or does the Second Amendment apply to everyone unless there's clear evidence that a specific person is actually dangerous? That's what the Supreme Court is going to have to figure out. Now, let me tell you how this case got to the Supreme Court in the first place. There's a man named Ali Mani, and to be completely honest with you, he's not someone who looks good on paper. The facts of his case are pretty bad, and I have to say that makes me worried about how this case might turn out. Usually when the government wants to win a case at the Supreme Court, they pick cases like this one where the person involved doesn't look like a sympathetic figure. When the person looks bad, it's easier for the government to get the judges to rule in their favor based on the facts rather than the constitutional principles. So who is Ali Mani? Well, he's a dual citizen of both the United States and Pakistan. Back in 2019, the FBI had him on their active watch list. When border agents searched his phone at a border crossing, they found messages that suggested he was willing to commit fraud for people connected to Iran and some extremist groups. That's obviously very serious stuff. Because of what they found, the FBI started looking into him more closely, and they discovered evidence that he was both using illegal drugs and selling them too. Based on all this information, the FBI got a warrant to search his home. When they went to his family's house, they found a Glock handgun, about 60 grams of marijuana, and several grams of cocaine. During questioning, Mani admitted that he smoked marijuana almost every other day. However, and this is an important detail, he wasn't actually high or using drugs at the exact moment when the FBI raided his home and found the gun. After he was charged under this federal law, Mani went to court and filed a motion to dismiss the charges. His argument was based on two recent Supreme Court cases called Bruin and Rahimi. He said that after those decisions, the Second Amendment doesn't allow the government to have a blanket ban like Section 922G3. And here's the surprising part. The trial court actually agreed with him. The judge dismissed the charges against him, saying the law violated the Second Amendment. The government appealed that decision to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. But the Fifth Circuit also sided with Mani. They threw out the charges against him, saying that based on their own previous decisions, this law can't be applied to someone who wasn't actually intoxicated at the time they had the gun. They said you can't punish someone just for being a drug user in general if they weren't high at the specific moment they possessed the firearm. That left the Department of Justice with only one option. They had to take the case to the Supreme Court. In June of 2025, The DOJ under the Trump administration filed a petition asking the Supreme Court to review the case. The case went to what's called a conference at the Supreme Court on September 29th. That's when all the justices get together and decide which cases they want to hear. And today, the Supreme Court issued an order saying they're going to take the case and make a decision on it. So what exactly is the question the Supreme Court will answer? They're going to decide whether 18 U.S.C. Section 922G3, that federal law that says people who use illegal drugs or are addicted to them can't have guns, violates the Second Amendment as applied to money specifically. Now that might sound narrow, but the implications are huge for millions of Americans. Let me tell you what arguments the Department of Justice made in their petition to the Supreme Court. First, they say that American history and tradition support taking guns away from people who are considered dangerous, and they argue that habitual drug users fall into that category. They point to historical laws that restricted guns from people who were intoxicated, people who were mentally ill, and other similar groups. They're trying to show that there's a long tradition of keeping guns away from people who might be impaired or dangerous. Second, the DOJ argues that Section 922G3 isn't a permanent ban. They say it's only temporary. It only applies while you're actively using drugs or while you're addicted to them. Once you get clean and stop using drugs, they say the ban doesn't apply to you anymore and you can own guns again. So they're trying to make it sound less severe than a lifetime ban. Third, they pointed out that there's a growing split between different federal appeals courts on this issue. Some courts are ruling one way and other courts are ruling differently. When that happens, the Supreme Court often steps in to settle the disagreement and create one clear rule for the whole country. And finally, they reminded the Supreme Court that just last term, they dealt with the question of prohibited persons in the Rahimi case. Since the Supreme Court already started addressing this issue, the DOJ argued they should continue and expand on what they said in that decision. Now I have to be honest with you about my concerns with this case. Just like in the Rahimi case, we have a really bad plaintiff here. The facts are terrible for anyone who supports gun rights. If anything, Mani might be an even worse plaintiff than the person in the Rahimi case was. When you have bad facts like this, it makes it much harder to get a good ruling that protects constitutional rights. However, I do think the Supreme Court might try to do the same thing they did in Rahimi. They might try to make their ruling as narrow as possible. They could make it a decision that's generally favorable to gun rights, but limit any negative impact to just Mani himself and his specific situation. The problem with that approach is we might get some bad language in the opinion, just like we got in Rahimi. In the Rahimi decision, the Supreme Court used some phrases that have caused problems. They talked about a more nuanced approach to Second Amendment cases and mentioned looking at things based on how society has changed over time. Now lower courts are using that language from Rahimi to justify all kinds of gun restrictions at both the federal and state level. They're using those words to uphold laws that probably should be struck down. So even if the Supreme Court rules the right way in this new case, the specific words they use in their opinion could cause problems down the road. The fundamental question the Supreme Court has to answer is this: does the Constitution only protect people the government decides to call law-abiding and responsible citizens? Or does it protect everyone unless there's clear proof that a specific person poses a real danger to society? This case is going to force the Supreme Court to finally answer that question directly. And make no mistake, this ruling isn't just going to affect one man in Texas. It's going to set the boundaries of Second Amendment rights for millions of Americans who want to own guns and might also engage in other activities that the government doesn't like. The decision could have massive ripple effects across the country. This case is also going to apply the standards that the Supreme Court laid out in both the Bruen and Rahimi decisions. That means we're going to get more clarity on how those standards work in practice. But it also means the court might include additional language in their opinion that could affect other gun rights cases going forward, even cases that have nothing to do with prohibited persons. We might see language that impacts cases about rifle bans, magazine capacity restrictions, concealed carry laws, and all sorts of other Second Amendment issues. When the Supreme Court writes an opinion, lower courts read every word very carefully and use that language to decide future cases. So whatever the Supreme Court says in this case could influence gun rights litigation for years to come. So what happens next? Well, now we're going to be watching this case very closely as it moves forward through the Supreme Court process. We'll be looking to see what legal arguments get made in the briefs. We'll pay attention to what amicus briefs get filed. Those are briefs from people and organizations who aren't part of the case, but want to share their views with the court. And then we'll be waiting to see when oral arguments get scheduled. That's when the lawyers for both sides will stand before the 9 justices and answer their questions about the case. As more information comes out about this case, and as it develops through the legal process, you'll want to keep paying attention. This is the kind of case that could reshape how we understand the Second Amendment for decades to come. The stakes are incredibly high, and the outcome is far from certain. We'll have to wait and see how the 9 justices decide to rule, but one thing is clear. This case is going to be watched very closely by everyone who cares about gun rights in America. If you found this information valuable, do me a favor and hit that like button right now. It helps get this critical information in front of more gun owners who need to know about these changes. And if you haven't subscribed yet, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss an update on your rights. Share this video with every gun owner you know because this information is too important to keep to yourself. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.